anniversary recently. So
Okay.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary. So besides being some guy who likes to talk a whole lot about ink, I've been in the SCA since I started when I was 14 years old. That's 26 years ago. I took about a 15-year break in the middle, and then when I showed back up to Chicago, not back up, when I showed up in Chicago, I said, hey, I should go do that SCA thing again. That sounds fun. And yeah, well, I'm married now because I met my wife in the SCA, so this is a good thing. I am the regional chatelaine for the, state of Indiana. We call it the Region of Constellation in the Middle Kingdom. I am a deputy signet for that region as well. And I've been doing Scribal stuff since about 2005. Started making ink in about 2007, born out of frustration. Well, I started making in 2007, and then I started looking around and asking questions like, how do you make ink? And nobody could give me an answer. Well, I do this, I've done this. Okay, well, where'd you get that from? Well, I got told. Okay, well, where'd they get their information from? Where are the sources? What's going on? I'm trying to do research here. So, for the last 8 years, I've been finding out about ink and searching about ink because I'm a scribe who wants to use period materials, and nobody can tell me anything. Which is not true. I've actually found some of them who do know what they're talking about, do have the sources, and we exchange information. But that's how I got interested in ink, was just born out of frustration that I couldn't get any information on ink, so let's do this. So that's how I started doing ink. I just think of myself as a scribe. The funny thing about the SCA is when we talk about scribal arts, we go calligraphy and illumination. Calligraphy and illumination, it's one word, right? Except it's not supposed to be. Calligraphy is the writing. Illumination is the gilding and working with the precious metals. So if you use a gold paint, that's illumination as well. Decoration is painting. The interesting thing about making ink is it crosses over all of that stuff because you end up finding information about all of those things. You started finding information about pigments, you start finding information about dyeing. Ink making was done by, it's one of the first things you learn, probably as an apprentice. Certainly by the time you were a journeyman, you knew how to make your own ink, if you were in the guilds at all, because they had these recipes that anybody could make ink from. And it wasn't written down for quite a while, and when it was mostly, take these items and throw them together, you already know the amounts roughly, don't worry about it. And so same for cutting a quill, which is what they use the ink with. And so people are often concerned about, can I use iron gall ink with my metal nib? And the answer is, of course you can. How many people here know how to clean a metal nib? Okay, the way you clean a metal nib, for those who didn't raise their hands, is take a toothbrush and you do this with soft soap on it. You clean it off. And then you have this reservoir thing that's stuck to it. And then you take your toothbrush and you stick it on there and you go between there, get the bristles, turn around, get the bristles. Take it off of your pen holder, of course, because you don't want to get the pen holder spring wet, that'll rust. You don't want the stem to get there. And then you take it and rinse it off underwater. You're done. That's how you clean your nib. And if you're not doing that to your metal nibs now, they're going to rust. I don't care what ink you put them in, because metal and liquid equals rust. Iron gall ink is not going to eat away your nibs any faster than any other type of ink. It's just not going to happen.
I feel better about sticking my nibs under the tap.
Absolutely. Water is metal's friend as long as you don't let them hang together for too long. You know those people that they get together and they're really awesome, and then in about 4 hours they start trying to kill each other? Yeah, that's how metal and water work. So don't let them get to the point where they're trying to kill each other, and you're fine. We have a frequently asked questions, we have how do we make ink, we have all this other stuff. Let me tell you a story. How many people here have not heard my story the first time I made ink? Because I've told it a few times since I've been here. All right.
I have not.
All right. So the first time I made ink, we had a coffee can, an old coffee can full of puffy oak galls. There's a lot of different kinds of oak galls out there. You have Aleppo oak galls. Aleppo oak galls are between 65 and 75% tannic acid in them. Tannic acid is what we're trying to pull out of the oak galls. That's going to help us make our ink. And then you have your European oak galls. Now, Aleppo oak galls come from the greater Syria area, so you're looking at Syria, Turkey, and that kind of area. Aleppo itself is actually in Syria. The British oak gall is between 55 and 65% tannic acid in it, and that's, you're going to pull that out. The North American oak gall is between 45 and 55% tannic acid. Not very much compared to the Aleppo oak gall. Even in period, the Aleppo oak gall was known to be the best oak gall to be using. They say, get the galls from Aleppo, they're better. Which tells you that there was a trade route that you could get them on. Which is fascinating to me. I'm trying to track things down, and well, trade routes and what they carry is not the easiest thing to find without paying lots and lots of money for a book. And checking them out is pretty hard, because they're out often. So that's what your oak galls are. The ones we had were western, the western coast, and they're big and they're poofy and they're papery and they feel like they're air. The Aleppo oak gall is a little hard marble. And so we took a can of those and dumped them in some water and we boiled it. All right, shouldn't we break that up? Sure. Took some of them out, broke some of them up, and threw them back in. They were already in the water. Then we're like, okay, that looks dark. Yeah, it smells funny. All right, I had ferrous sulfate, and it was in an old medicine pill bottle. Okay, threw that in. Hey, it turned black. Hey, we made ink. So we took our metal dip pens and tried to find a place between where the oak galls were floating and stuck our pen in and went, hey, it's black! Maybe we should get the oak galls out. And so we skimmed them out. And after we skimmed them, we went, okay, shouldn't we have gum arabic in there? Oh, yeah, sure. Threw gum arabic in. We had no idea what we were doing. It was me, my apprentice sister, who, I had an AOA, my apprentice sister who had a grant level award, my Laurel, and her husband. That's who was in the kitchen. We had no idea what we were doing. I will argue whether or not we made ink or not. The answer is yes, we did. But we only made ink once we put in the gum arabic. How many people here know the difference between ink, dye, and paint? I see a hand start to be raised. What are they?
So, paint stays on the surface.
Very good.
Dye becomes one with the fibers and the stuff. There's little receptors on your fibers, and they attach with the dye molecules, usually with a mordant. I'm a fiber artist. I should warn there.
That's good. And that explanation is really good. I had a slightly different way of saying it, but that explanation is excellent. So what's ink?
I have absolutely no idea, but I had 2 of 3, and I figured that was close enough.
No, that's actually a lot better than most people. The way I describe dye is that it fundamentally changes which it comes in contact with. What is a stain? A stain is a dye that is someplace you don't want it to be, kind of like a weed. A weed is any plant that grows where you don't want it to be. That's what a stain is.
So we call a stain a fugitive dye.
Okay, and I understand that.
In the dye world.
Right, and that's the vernacular of the dye world.
Yeah,
for those of us who
absolutely.
are not necessarily in it, that's the other way of looking at it. The idea being that it fundamentally changes what it comes in contact with. And ink is an intermediary substance between paint and a dye.
Oh, okay.
It is neither, but it acts like both, kind of. Ink comes from the word encustum, which is the same word as where the caustic comes from. So ink bites in, like acid will, or burns in, but it also stays on the surface a little bit. And so it's actually a little bit of both. That's what ink is. Now, can you write with a dye? Of course you can. Can you write with paint? People do it all the time. At that point in time, the term is writing fluid. They're not inks, because you didn't change them to an ink, but they didn't become an ink just because you wrote with them. But they are writing fluid. There's a lot of things we write with today that are not inks that we call inks that are actually writing fluids. Does it matter? No. But it's important for the purposes where you're going to make ink that you know that you're making ink, or at least what writing fluid you're making. So that's what ink is. Those are the differences. And you can write with all sorts of different things. So that's the quick, easy discussion on ink. What kind of questions do people have? People want to know how to make ink.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to talk about, there are 2 different types of black ink. There's your carbon inks and there's your chemical inks. Carbon inks are any ink that you would have carbon in it. I know that sounds kind of redundant, but that would be, you burnt a piece of wood, it's black. You take that, you crush it up, you put some vinegar in with it, you crush it up some more until it's nice and thin, you put put in some more water, and you put in some gum arabic, and congratulations, you have a carbon ink. The other, and that's a very smelly?
No, simple.
It's very simple. At what point in time did I say making ink was difficult? Okay, all right. So it's a very simple
I was going to say, for the record, dye is also very simple and sounds very much like your...
Mordants are not simple.
They are simple. They can be simple.
Excellent. Teach your class on that.
They can be simple.
So,
not if you want reproducible though.
The next carbon ink that is very, very common is something called lamp black ink. You take lamp, it has oil. The smoke from an oil lamp is black. You take in period they liked copper pots, but whatever would work. You take metal, you stick it over it, and you collect that stuff. And when you think you have enough, you scrape it off. Usually a feather works. Depends on, how thick you're letting it get. Sumi ink, they let it get really thick and they use a scraper to get it off, but that's its own thing. They had funny things, and wow, Sumi ink is a really good carbon ink. But you have your lamp black ink, and when the lamp black is collecting, and you scrape that off, and then you put it in water, and it doesn't, wait, that's oil residue in water. What are you thinking? Oh, well, you gotta get an emulsifier of some kind, right? No, you can also use a suffocant. Oxgall. Oxgall is essentially the stomach acid of a cow. You can also use the gall of an ox, but it pretty much all holds the same stuff. But it's all called Oxgall, and you can purchase that in almost every hobby store that sells paint supplies. And it's a suffocant. Now the fun thing about Oxgall stuff is it absolutely destroys surface tension. So if you're having a problem with your ink not wanting to come out very much, you take your brush, you dip your brush in the Oxgall, you get most of it out, then you go flick, flick, and you put it away. And that flick, flick will destroy the surface tension in your ink, and your ink will now flow amazingly differently than it was previously. Please do not confuse the concept of surface tension of your liquid, in this case ink, with viscosity. Those are two different things. And they both affect how things flow a lot, and that's its own long conversation. So,
that's fine.
But that's lamp black, that's your carbon inks. Chemical inks are iron gall ink. Iron gall ink has been known since at least the time of Pliny the Younger. And we know that because he went, hey, look, and wrote like 3 lines about ink. And so that's what we call the earliest recipe for iron gall ink. Because it talks about the ingredients, and it kind of says put them together. Of course, most recipes like this never include amounts or anything else. So we know that it has existed for at least then. One of the oldest complete books that we have that's written with iron gall ink is a Bible from about 350, 300 AD. And that is some codex. All of a sudden I'm blanking on it. Of course I'm teaching a class, why wouldn't I? But that Bible they know is written in iron gall ink, and the nice thing is that iron gall ink is very easy. You stick it under a spectrometer and go, oh look, there's iron in it, and a little bit of sulfur. So that must be iron gall ink. And that's how we know it's non-destructive. It works very, very well. Iron gall ink was used at least in the United States up until about 1950. The United States Postal Service had its own recipes for how to make it for their local post offices so that they could make it so that people would have their dip pen to address things with. So this ink has been around a couple thousand years, about. It became very pervasively popular in the Middle Ages, and certainly through the late period for the SCA of 1600 AD. It is by far and away the most used ink. It's one of the most important inks in the history of mankind, at least for Europe. I like to do a thought experiment with people for a second, if we can. For a minute, stop and think about every manuscript you may have seen, every court scroll you have seen, every book you've ever read. Now imagine that all the ink is gone. That's how important ink is. Yeah, we have a heart attack happening over here, people having a hard time breathing. That is how important ink is. And that's how important to the SCA this ink is, because the vast majority of our research comes from manuscripts that used it. Yes?
I always am hesitant on how much teachers want the interruptions. So
It's a discussion.
what is the working difference, I mean, other than composition, but in terms of longevity and stability and working with between the carbon ink and the iron gall?
Absolutely excellent question. Iron gall ink is more permanent.
Right.
A simple, easy way to answer that is iron gall ink is more permanent. The longer explanation is that carbon inks really do not bite in very well. Even when you use vinegar, which is an acid, they don't bite in very well. They act much more like a paint, although they are an ink, because they do bite in. So what happens is that it can flake off and fall off a lot easier.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to take a wet object and wipe the page clean. Literally wipe the page clean. And therefore, it's a lot easier to fake documents.
Oh.
Stop and think about it. Documents being faked is nothing new. Been around since we've had writing. Right? So, if you don't like what something says, you walk over to the ink, you change it a little bit, and you write in what you want. And if it's carbon ink, it's almost impossible to detect. If it's iron gall ink, it becomes much easier to detect. Because at that point in time, you have to scrape the area. Now, if you're using vellum, which is either a highly processed parchment or it is the skin that comes from a calf, we're finding out that highly processed sheet works just like it because they're doing actual DNA tests on manuscripts. And the stuff that we thought was parchment, which the stuff that they thought came from a cow, didn't. So that the difference between parchment and vellum is being exploded right now. It's hugely being exploded right now. For a while, in England, if all tax rolls, which means I show up at your place and you're supposed to give me 5 pigs, 2 chickens, and a couple bales of hay. That's me as a tax person. He goes, I'll give you 10 shekels to knock off 3 of everything. I get 10 shekels out of this. Why wouldn't I do it? So, I rub it off, I write it back in, and hey, this is the tax register that you're supposed to give. I write down that's what you did give me. I'm 10 shekels richer, and away we go. And he's, richer too, without having paid more. So it was required in England that the tax records were written on sheep skin on the fat side with iron gall ink.
Oh yeah.
Because you are not going to be able, that was a tamper resistance thing in period. You're not going to be able to fake that. When that gets scraped, we're going to notice. Now, you're going to get away with it until somebody else checks it, and if you don't bribe them, oh wait, it's not foolproof, no system is, but it made it much more difficult to defraud the government, and that's why they did that.
Well, at least they had to work for it.
Oh yeah, and on the fat side and on sheepskin, it's almost impossible to scrape, it really is. Doesn't matter how well processed. It does, but they're not going to use that processing for tax rolls. So iron gall ink is much more permanent. It is obviously very chemically different as well. So it is more water resistant, it is more permanent, it is more difficult to tamper without being noticed.
So would carbon ink be more likely for household casual use?
No.
Because it sounds easier to make too.
It is easier to make in small amounts. Iron
Yeah,
gall ink is
exactly.
easier to make in larger amounts. Depends on how much your household is going to be using them, considering that the vast majority of people didn't write. I'm not going to say that they weren't literate. We're also exploiting that myth as well. But that's a different class.
Just generally didn't bother writing stuff down.
Right. Well, the peasants had to be literate, and especially in England, had to be literate enough to know what the laws were because they were the ones that were supposed to be enforcing it onside their own property. And if they had a problem, they were going to take it to the court. They had to know what the laws were. So they were essentially training miniature lawyers, whether they knew it or not, because the lords didn't want to deal with it. But again, that's its own class. But this stuff is being put in cookbooks, how to make ink. It's where you can find most of your ink recipes, by the way, is cookbooks.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough. So, did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Let me give you guys a recipe for iron gall ink. It's a very simple recipe. Go ahead and write it down. Or memorize it, but I have a tendency of thinking the reason that we write things down is so that we don't have to memorize it. That's why we have writing.
Hence the ink.
Hence the idea of ink. So, I have a pen if people need it.
I have spare.
Need your pen?
I
Nope,
got
you got it? All right, so the ink that I make that does not go on clear, goes on nice and black, maybe, you know, or at least gray and turns black within 15 seconds, depending on the batch, because remember those percentages I gave you? They're a range, not a specific, that this makes quality control nigh impossible, and that's okay, because it's the period way of doing it. If I wanted quality control, I would buy tannic acid, which, by the way, does come in a dry form, a powder form. But that's not what I want. I want to make period ink.
Any brewery
Yeah,
store.
pretty much. So, 6 ounces Aleppo oat galls. If you do not have Aleppo oat galls, remember I already gave you percentages? Do the math. Now I'm giving this to you in American measurements. No, I'm not giving it to you in imperial measurements, because those are the measurements you will find them in English, is imperial measurements. Okay? It's easy enough to translate over. By the way, are period measurements modern measurements? The answer to that is no. So what measurements am I giving you? Am I giving you the ounce from England, the ounce from France, the ounce from Italy? Because those are all different measurements. The answer is depends. One of the most common books that we use, that people try to grab from, is the Book of Secrets, sold under the sign of the gun, 1596. White Stag, I think. There are a lot of Book of Secrets out there, like, you know, everything was called a Book of Secrets. And it's from 1596. And it has a recipe this long, and it tells you that it's translated from Italian. Okay, so you translated the words from Italian. Did you translate the measurements from Italian? Because the Italian ounce is not the English ounce. Nobody can answer that question for me. Because there's no way to know, unless somebody wrote down somewhere that's what they did or didn't. So you're getting measurements that I get in the recipes because, and then I use American, imperial, British imperial, modern measurements to do this. I have a book that tells me what the measurements actually are, and I have some of those translated online. But 6 ounces Aleppo oat galls.
How do you spell the Lapo?
A-L-E-P-P-O.
Oh,
And if I'm wrong, it's A-L-E-P-O, but
It's so close.
period spelling, it works.
I know.
It's all phonetic. All right, so 6 ounces of oat galls. 1 ounce ferrous sulfate. And period, that's going to be that 1 ounce of ferrous sulfate. By the way, you can write that Fe Roman numeral 2, SO4 2, sub 2.
Say that again, please.
Anybody here speak chemistry? I barely do, but I do. Fe, Roman numeral 2, that tells you how many electrons are in the valence. If you don't understand what that means, don't worry about it. It's technical chemistry stuff that's fantastic and wonderful.
Iron likes to play in different forms.
Yeah. S, sulfur. O, oxygen. 4 oxygens so that the electrons can interact with the sulfur. We're going to ignore this. This is from yesterday. And there's 2 of those ions. So it's FeSO4 2. It's iron sulfate. It's also called copperas in period. C-O-P-E-R-A-S. And it's also known as green vitriol. By the way, vitriol is SO4. Usually it's a sulfuric acid, but not always. You'll see vitriol on a lot of things. And they're talking about sulfuric acid essentially at that point. FeSO4, iron sulfate, green vitriol. Blue vitriol, by the way, is copper sulfate, and that does get used in the ingredients as well. Talk about that later though. For this purposes, it's 6 ounces Aleppo oat galls, 1 ounce ferrous sulfate, 1 ounce gum arabic crystals, not liquid, crystals. You can usually buy this from Natural Pigments, Kramer Pigments, Sinopia, places that do arts stuff for people that don't want to buy it. They want to make their own. It costs about $20 a kilo. No, not bad at all. Then there's shipping and handling, and that's just going to change depending on where you are, what country you're in, and where the origin is. Kramer Pigments is a German company, but they have a store in New York. I think it's New York City. So, borders are borders. So see what you can find that would make it work best for you.
There's got to
All
be
right.
Canadian suppliers somewhere.
I actually got mine from natural pigments.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and I don't know where they're out of. Now, you haven't heard me mention a liquid yet. 1 gallon water, distilled. Just go to the store, go to the water aisle, buy store-bought distilled water. That is the closest thing you're going to get to a period rainwater, or a period water that wasn't from a well. There is 0 recipes that tell you to get it from a well. I have, in my experience, there might be some, but every recipe that tells you where to get the water from says clean running water or rainwater. That's it. They don't want the stuff that gets messed up. Anybody here done brewing? Okay, now this is before refrigeration. There was a brewery, brewery / pub in London that was absolutely famous for the fact that a beer would last 2 weeks, a batch, without refrigeration. And it was because of the acidity of their well water. They understood that not all water was the same, and they were trying to get the cleanest, purest water they could, so rainwater and clean running water were their choices. Well, rainwater today has a pH of 5. Your tap water has chemicals that have been put in it to keep it, unless you're pulling it straight from a lake or something like that, that people know that the water is pretty clean, has chemicals that are put in it because it's been treated so that, the microbes aren't in it that are going to kill you. All right? So it's going to have chlorine in it at the very least. Get the distilled water. The steam distilled water that you buy at the store is not by any quality lab-grade distilled water. My wife was a PhD in biomolecular chemistry. Goes, yeah, technically it's distilled, but I would never use it in the lab. It's not pure enough for her, at least for the stuff that she needs for a water that needs to be distilled. Their stuff is much more pure, but it's pretty close analog to a good pure rainwater, and that's why I use it. That's it. That's your recipe. Boil up the alcohols until the water turns to a dark coffee or dark tea color. That usually takes about an hour. If you can't put in the entire gallon of water into your container at a time, don't worry about it. As long as it's in there by the end of it, you're fine. What you're trying to do is leach out that tannic acid. Filter once it gets to the color that you want it to be. Pour it through a filter. Coffee filters are a bad choice. They're slow. They're terrible. They don't even work well. However, it's what I used for years because I didn't know any better. Pour it through linen. Get scraps of linen. If you don't use scraps, do not tell the fiber arts people that you were using non-scraps of linen. Just don't. They will hunt you down and kill you.
We will.
The pitchforks and the fire things will come out, but as long as you're wearing linen, they won't burn you. You're okay. They might strip it off of you, but they're not going to kill you while you're wearing it.
I was going to say, if
Anyway.
you're wearing wool, it will burn.
It's hot enough, it will.
You have to really work at it. It
Yeah,
smolders
well,
better.
That's what the bonfires are for, with the
Some
stakes.
people put in the effort though.
Yeah. So
At least make them work for it.
So the reality is linen is a fantastic filter. It actually gets out the fine dust stuff. I was stupefied. You pour it through it and you're like, wow, that's just going right. How is that filtering? It's just going right through. And then you hold it up and you're like, I have muck. Wow, I have a fine silt in this. It works very, very well as a way to filter it. It's a very period way to filter it. You can use muslin. Muslin is a much lesser weave, so you're going to get some grit. You can use cheesecloth. Modern cheesecloth is sort of an abomination. Nonetheless, modern cheesecloth does work. Just use more layers of it. Linen. Just use linen. Yeah, it's expensive to buy per yard if you're not, depending on where you're getting it from. But you need a square this big. I stick it over a plastic funnel, and I pour it through that way. And that way I have a support for the linen, so that this boiling hot liquid that I'm pouring through doesn't burn my hands. Otherwise, you're going to need, to hold it out like this and have somebody else pour, right? Well, I'm doing this by myself. Funnel, then pour, you're fine. The plastic is non-reactive. It's not going to change anything, so you're fine. You filtered that out, put it back in your pot, or in the container that you're in there. Go ahead and throw in your ferrous sulfate. Notice to throw in your ferrous sulfate first, because Arabic is going to retard the reaction, which means it's going to slow it. It's not going to make it not happen, but in my experience, it really greatly slows down the reaction. So the gum arabic just goes in last. And you stir. And you stir. And you stir some more. When you throw in that ferrous sulfate, it's going to go black now. It's instant. And you can kind of watch how it billows out. It's really kind of fun. But the gum arabic needs time to dissolve. You can put it in a few crystals at a time and stir, or you can dump it in all at once and stir. Basically, you're going to be stirring this for a long time. Or come back every hour or so and stir it for the rest of the day. Wait until it gets dissolved.
Letting it cool off at any point during this process?
Only so much as I need to handle it or not destroy the container that it is going in.
Okay, so you don't have to have it like cool by the time that you add any of the other.
No, and heat actually will, in this case, speed the reaction. Yeah. And it doesn't change the reaction as far as I've been able to notice. If you cannot boil your oat galls, let them soak for 2 weeks. So you're gonna do, let them soak for a couple of weeks. You will probably get mold on it. If you don't, you have a better filter in your house than I do. And somehow opening your door doesn't let stuff in. Mold is good. Mold makes your ink blacker. I often will have a batch of ink that will grow mold after it is made. I smile when that happens. It makes your ink better. 7 years ago, I was doing research and I was looking at the Library of Congress, and one of the things they said is the finer inks had mold. So the mold is eating sugars that are there, and especially if you have the gum arabic in there, it's going to be eating on the gum arabic as well, because there's a lot of food for it there. But, and then it's pissing out something that makes it blacker and better. I have no idea what it is.
So you just skim that off before you use it? And go
Yes, then take off, before you dip a pen into it, just take it right off.
I've known people to say that when you have iron gall ink, to refrigerate it to keep that from happening. So just skip that and just let it happen.
Well, they didn't refrigerate in period. Why would I refrigerate it now?
Indeed.
And I don't want mold on my iron gall ink. Why? Because you're a modern person who's paranoid that mold is all bad?
It's not like you're going to drink the ink.
Exactly.
And hopefully they don't ever have blue cheese.
Well, no, that's the thing, is that anything I'm telling you, whatever you need to know what your allergies are,
Yeah,
and you're
exactly.
responsible for that. But if you have a mold allergy, absolutely you don't want mold. It goes without saying. But you're making this for yourself, or if you're going to be giving it out, then you need to let people know what you've done and that there might be mold in it. It's one of the reasons, by the way, I don't sell ink that has molded. I don't use molding in my ink process, making processes for the ink that I give out or I sell. I don't want it to go to somebody who, you might not have it, but when you give it to her, she might. So I won't sell that stuff, personally. You can give it out, make sure people know. If I was going to sell it, or give it away, in the ingredients, I would write mold, unknown, and call it good. Because at that point, I have informed people. And that's just good ethics. Done a lot so that's iron gall ink. That's a simple, easy iron gall ink recipe. I do have, you can get a hold of me on Facebook, Ian the Green on Facebook, and I will be happy to send you a link to my Dropbox that has my ink recipes in it. I don't know how many ink recipes I have in there. I have, on PDF, Merrifield's 12th to 18th centuries, what is it? Its original treatise is 12th to 18th centuries, and it tells you when the time period is, so you don't have to go out of period. And that is a book that is full of recipes for pigments, dyes, inks, and some glass and other stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, Philadelphia P. Merrifield or something. All of a sudden, the names were starting to escape me again. And that's, you get a lot of recipes there. So we've been talking about black inks. Colored inks are a different game. Now you're starting to look at dyes that you turn into an ink. One of the more popular ones is Brazil wood. Unfortunately, Brazil wood has recently been declared to be endangered. And so it's going to become very difficult to get it. There are some ethics involved about whether you think it's appropriate to get it anymore. There are woods, and what that is, it's an acid-base indicator. It's called hematoxylin. There are other woods that are out there that have hematoxylin just in lower amounts. I don't recall what those are, I'm sorry.
I don't either.
But they do exist. Hematoxylin. And if you don't know how to spell it, congratulations, you're, in the 99th percentile. If you type it into Google, it will correct you. Google is my online spell check. Type it in and it goes, no, you meant this. You're right, I meant that. Sometimes it tells me I meant this, and I went, no, I'm looking for the period spelling, I don't want yours. But hematoxin is not one of those things. So, it is an acid-base indicator. The recipe for that is also stupid easy. 1 ounce Brazil wood, 3 cups vinegar, soak overnight. In the morning, reduce by half, filter out the Brazil wood, retain it, filter it out, throw in 1.2 grams alum, aluminum alum, not food alum, aluminum alum. You can find alum in the spice aisle, it's not the right alum. We're looking for aluminum alum. Throw in 1.2 grams gum arabic. I don't have anything that measures 1.2 grams. The recipe calls for 2 pennyworths alum, 2 pennyworths gum arabic. A penny weight is 0.6 grams, so 1.2 grams. I often end up throwing in about 2 grams. Here's the funny thing. You have a cup and a half of liquid when you're done with this. And then so you're going to throw these things in after you're going to put you take out the Brazil wood, and then you still have the liquid that's in there, and it's supposed to continue to be heated. Okay? And it says when you throw it in, make sure it doesn't boil over. It's 1.2 grams of alum to 3 cups of liquid. What do you mean? Oh my God! That 1.2 grams took the boiling from this to another 4 inches in my pot. It completely changes it. And it takes it from this yellow color that was from overnight soaking to a bright red. It says if you want to make it redder, you may add a little bit of chalk. By a little bit of chalk, it means no more than a gram. I stuck in a little too much once. That changes it to purple because the base. Hematoxylin, which is what we're pulling out of the Brazil wood, is an acid-base indicator that is extremely finicky. It also produces gorgeous, gorgeous stuff, but it is extremely finicky. I recommend that you do not use a metal dip pen when using Brazil wood ink. And that comes from a variety of experiences of people have been writing with it, including my own, where it turns purple. And it can turn so purple that it looks black. I had to look at it under my microscope to find out what was going on. I went, oh, that's not black, that's just a deep purple. Okay, because it's metal. I had other friends who were like, I used a metal pen with it, it's not a problem. So I clean my stuff, and I clean my stuff, and I get out a brand new nib that only has a little bit of oil on it, and I clean that oil off of it, and it still turns purple. For me. For other people, it doesn't. So I just say use a quill. I highly recommend using a quill because the stuff is finicky.
Drugs for your class.
Thank you.
Your daughter wanted
Daddy! You were on film.
Mommy, get some donut for you.
That was really nice of her, wasn't it? Better go find Mommy though, huh?
Come on.
No, I gotta stay here and teach.
Will you let us keep Daddy for a few more minutes?
Give me a hug. All right, go get Mommy.
Come on.
Let's go look at your target.
No, we're not
My adorable daughter.
I made the whole class.
I can go home now. So, and Brazil wood will make purple ink, it will make red ink, it will make violet ink. It doesn't make a very good yellow ink. You need apple bark for that. Apple bark. So, go to an apple tree. Crab apple tree, doesn't matter what kind of apple tree. Take out the outer bark. Scrape off the inner bark. By the way, pick a branch. If you do this on the trunk, make sure you do it only in a patch. Do not go all the way around. You will kill the tree. Okay? Scrape it off. You don't need a whole lot. By the time...
Do it to a neighbor you don't like. Oh wait,
I
on
do not
film.
condone that.
No, don't do it to a neighbor you don't like.
Especially don't do it to a neighbor you don't like, they'll come get you. You take it off, and then you take it over, and you're getting your stuff ready, and it's already turned yellow on you. It's stupid easy to make this stuff. That's essentially add a little bit of water, a little bit of vinegar, and until you get it to this way you want it to, and then you add some gum arabic. Do some boiling. That's the recipes I have seen for yellow ink. It's not hard. What's your experience?
So I play in the, so yellow in the dye world is like the, oh, damn it, I got yellow again. Because everything in the dye world horks up yellow at you.
Yeah,
And it's
well,
just various sad, pathetic shades of yellow.
this makes a pretty good yellow to write with, but who writes with yellow?
Well, there is also that. And there's only so much yellow clothing any sane person desperately wants. And I like yellow,
I
unlike
mean, the
most of
green,
the
I don't
world.
understand what you're talking about. So,
I don't want yellow.
I love yellow. And there is a point in the dye world where you go, damn it, I got another yellow. But the one I usually use is a turmeric base.
right, but that doesn't work for ink.
And I was going to ask how that played with ink. Because
No, well,
it
you
tends
can do
to
it.
be fairly fugitive in the dye world.
Right, and therefore ink, when you're writing documents in the Middle Ages, how often do you want that document to not be readable in 5, 10 years? The answer is almost never. Now here's the other question, how often is that book going or scroll going to be exposed to the light? So the whole concept of fugitive ink is a problem, and they did want permanence, especially in anything that was a legal document, or the Bible, or, you know, the Psalters and prayer books. But the reality is that there's a good tree sap ink out there, hawthorn berry ink, hawthorn ink, that you go ahead and harvest those hawthorn berries at a certain time of the year, and then maybe a few weeks later, harvest it a different way, harvest the same exact berries, and you'll get 2 different colors because the chemistry internally has changed. But you prepare them exactly the same, and one will come out green, the other one will come out yellow. But the green one, I have some of that stuff. If you saw my Scribal display yesterday, you saw it in a shell, and it was green. You just add a little bit of water, dip it in, right. You have green ink. Green ink was used a lot. Red ink was used more. Blue ink was used a little bit more. Purple ink was used mostly for decorations. Green ink was also, green and blue inks were also used in writing, but more for decorations and doing pen work and lines. We all think that the decorations have to be all painted in. The vast majority of decorations, when you're not looking at, oh, these are the pristine, awesome documents, which we all love to look at. Come on, we do.
Oh, yeah.
It's line work. Somebody drew it in. It's
So-
usually not painted.
Was the
Hold
blue, oh, sorry, go ahead.
One of the things that's always been important, because I noted this with a lot of earlier scrolls, is that before Iron Doll became popular in the SCA, you give out an award scroll, 9 times out of 10, somebody's going to frame it and slap it on their wall. It's getting light all the time.
Right, so for
And
us,
they
it can
will
be
fade
very-
over time unless you're using the good ink, which is what got me into using Iron Doll in the first place, is that hangs on the wall, it still looks great in 20 years.
Chemically speaking, iron gall ink, the components. All right, so anytime that you create a chemical reaction, we all learned that you have to balance your chemical reaction in chemistry class that if we ever went. Here's the reality. No chemical equation ever balances perfectly. Because in reality, it doesn't matter if you have the exact right amounts, not all of those molecules touched one another to cause a reaction, so you always have a little bit of stuff hanging off from the original thing. Well, tannic acid, when light hits it, gets dark. Ferrous sulfate, when light hits it, gets darker. It's not just light fast, it turns darker with the reaction of photons, always. Now that said, it can also break down the iron from being Fe. When you make ink, this is Fe2. Fe2 is not a particularly stable version of iron. Fe3, which is what it turns into, is extremely stable. That is the black iron. You know, the stuff you get on your cast iron skillet? Because iron is a silver metal. Why isn't your cast iron skillet silver? Because it has an incrustation on the surface of iron 3, which is extremely stable. The rust, which is red, is not stable. Enough exposure to light, liquid, air, humidity, can turn the Fe3 to an Fe2 that will rust. And you do get ink burn through and things like that. However, this whole thing is how caustic is iron gall ink? We know that there's ink burn through, or ink corrosion is what it's also more technically called. That's a horrible, horrible problem, and they're right, it is. But there are hundreds of thousands of medieval documents written with iron gall ink that don't have even a bit of it. So the problem isn't just the ink, the problem is the history that is behind it, how it was handled, where it was stored, what environment it was stored in, and what it was written on, and how those impurities are going to interact with each other. And they don't have a definitive answer for why it happens, when it happens, but they know when it happens, we're rushing to save a lot of those documents. 1898, I think, was the first time there was an international conservation conference ever called. It was called by the Vatican, and it's called the St. Gall Conference. It was the first time that the concept of ink corrosion was ever discussed throughout the known world. So the whole conservation conference was called because of iron gall ink. But the reality is that this is not an ink that you have to worry about. People are like, well, it's acidic, it can't, it really can't be archival quality. Right, that's why we have books that are 1,700 years old that still exist, that were written in this that have not had ink burned through. I think that, one of the ways they used to define it, I don't know it today, if this is still true, is that for something to be considered archival, it had to be known to last, or be predicted to be able to last 500 years or more. Iron gall wins. Absolutely wins. That does not mean it doesn't come with dangers. It does. But it's not going to eat. It's not going to eat your ink. It's not going to eat your paper. It's not going to eat your parchment. It's not going to eat your pens as long as you clean them off appropriately. And we're not writing legal documents that need to leave the last 500 years anyway.
Yeah, you can give an award scroll to your great-grandkids and it'll still look fabulous.
Exactly. Absolutely. All right, so we've talked about making red ink. We've talked about making purple ink. We've talked about making iron gall ink and carbon ink. Yes?
Just to jump back for one little second.
Absolutely.
You said 3 cups of vinegar. What kind of vinegar? White vinegar?
So here's the fun part.
Oh.
Current vinegar of today is acetic acid and water. That's how vinegar is made today, most of the time. They distill it to kill off everything that's in it. Period vinegar was, okay, we have our fruit, we've had juice that comes out of it, we're going to let it ferment in the air, oxygen. And it will turn to vinegar. And now we will use it as vinegar. That's period vinegar, people. It's not a difficult thing to do. Period alcohol was, here's our fruit, here's our juice. We're going to seal it off from the air so it works aerobically, so it burps up carbon dioxide and pisses out vinegar. Pardon me, alcohol. Sorry. Vinegar is not wine that has gone bad. It's the juices of fruits that we're not allowed to make alcohol. And so it makes vinegar instead. So we have acetic acid and water and fruit and other stuff of chemicals that is not pure acetic acid and water, which is almost all of your vinegars today. So, what vinegar to use? I use a white vinegar when I have to. Otherwise, I go to farmer markets and I buy raw vinegar. Raw vinegar is, at least in the United States of America, not supposed to be being consumed. It's not for human consumption, kind of like raw milk is not supposed to be sold for human consumption, depending on the laws of your state. And by the way, raw milk is illegal to transport across state lines.
It's also illegal in Ontario.
So I don't know the laws in Canada at all along those lines, but you say it's illegal in Ontario. Is it
Yeah, there's
illegal?
been a big fight about it in the
There's
news.
the
and
raw
I have
milk.
extremely hippie in-laws, so I know a little bit the fight with raw milk.
Raw milk is becoming another thing. I'm not going to get into the legality or the political issues. I'm just telling you these are realities. By the way, milk has period purposes. Makes really good cheese. But
So
I don't know, but
balsamic vinegar.
also, most balsamic vinegar that we get in North America isn't really truly balsamic anyway. They're just additives that they throw into it and then they call it balsamic. I just use a white vinegar and call it good. In the United States, you can get a gallon of it for about $1.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think it's $1.20 here.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. It's a stupid cheap vinegar and it works. Otherwise, like I say, I go to farmer markets and I get raw vinegar if I can. And of course, I don't eat it or use it in any capacity for ingestion. I use it to make ink. And everyone's like, oh, so what are you going to be using this for? Oh, I'm in a recreations group. Because when you tell them that you're going to make ink out of their food, sometimes they get a little upset with you. Now, what else can you use?
On your French fries.
Which is very typical here. I actually like that.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
It's all vinegar.
Yeah, I went, ooh, malted vinegar, I'm going to put this on my fries. Now, I've told you about using water. What other ingredients did they use? Wine, brandy, which is called strong wine often, beer. They're all perfectly valid for making ink out of. I cannot tell you how hard it is to get raw wine. I've tried. Even SCA brewers do not like to make raw beer, raw wine.
What makes wine raw?
That's was gonna knock.
What step is it missing?
you are not making sure that microbes don't get into it. You're not introducing just your microbe.
Yeah, so basically you're letting it turn to vinegar.
No.
Yeah.
It's still done in an environment that is sealed off from oxygen. It's just you didn't get to pick what microbes.
So the equivalent of using
And so
wild
it's not-
yeast.
Essentially, except that it's even less than that because you're using a wild yeast. This is whatever happens to be in the air, and also is less clean,
Right.
and therefore not for human consumption, because today we went, you know, it's not going to happen often, but you can get killed from that, or at least make you really sick sometimes, rarely. So it's really hard to get this stuff. And I've had people who went, oh yeah, I'll get you some, oh I have some, and then, oh I forgot to bring it. So it's really hard to get it if you can use it, because it's going to be chemically different than the wines today, which go, especially commercial wines or commercial beers, all of which go through a heat treatment process to kill off microbes. Mold is good. Microbes are good in our ink. We like our microbes. It's going to change what the ink does. How is it going to change it? I don't know, because I haven't had a chance to test it. But I do know that when, it's going to produce, going to change it. So, what can you, go ahead.
Well, with the wild, you mean when they're done making the alcohol, they cook it again?
Essentially, they distill it. They
pasteurize it.
pasteurize it, that's the word. I'm like, not distill, pasteurize it. Yeah, they pasteurize it again.
When you brew, one of the problems, like you'll bottle something, it's still
Growing.
And so you have to burp your bottles and stuff occasionally. So when you buy production beer, they have pasteurized it to kill off all of the remaining.
To make it stable.
What?
Can you use mead to make ink?
I have not seen a recipe that says you can, but however, it is an alcohol, and therefore theoretically possible. I would be reticent to do so because mead comes from honey. Honey is hygroscopic,
Okay. never
which
mind.
means it pulls in
Right,
air
like
out of, it pulls in water
13
out of the air.
gallons of mead brewed at home.
It's, yeah, it can be done. I'm not saying it can't. I just would be reticent
Might
to
be
do it.
worth trying.
Yeah, exactly, in my opinion, it's worth trying. So what other forms of iron, because what we're doing with the chemical with iron going ink is we're using the iron, we're changing it, but what if you can't get a hold of ferrous sulfate? What do they use in period? Scraps of iron, you throw it in there and let it soak, because it'll work after a while.
Iron pot.
Iron pots were very, very rare. Copper and brass.
Yeah.
Iron pots were extremely rare. They actually, most of their cooking of the recipes for ink, they tell you to use a earthen vessel, clean, never used before. They do not even, they specifically very often will tell you, do not have any kind of a coating on it, of any kind. So basically bisqueware. And in small clay pots. They didn't use metal.
Okay, they probably also figured
So,
out that
but
it
one of the recipes that's
wasn't-
one of the more interesting ones, if I may,
yeah.
sorry, is heat up an iron ingot until it is red hot, throw it in. See that in more than one recipe. And why do you need to be iron hot, glowing hot? So the heat will make the water come to it, evaporate off quickly and boil, but it's going to pull iron particles with it.
Yeah.
And therefore the iron is getting into solution. Because how hard is it to get iron to dissolve in just regular water? Well, we have battleships that were sunk more than 60 years ago that still exist. Must be pretty hard. And that's salt water, which is really caustic. So, it's not the best way, but you do what you got. Yeah. Here's another way to do it. I talked about copper sulfate earlier. In the hierarchy of reactions, iron is higher up than copper. So if I can get copper sulfate and I can throw it in solution with a piece of iron, the copper will fall out of solution and will pull the iron into solution. Whether they knew that that was chemically what was going on or not is irrelevant. What they figured out was I put in the copper sulfate and get good ink, and it's black. They didn't, they may not have understood what the reaction was, but boy, it worked. Yes?
What did they use for blue ink?
Depends on what they were doing and things. There are some chemical blue inks, there are some natural blue inks as well. And it is 10:01. I think my next class starts at 10:15. I hope it starts at 10:15.
I have no idea.
So, any other questions about ink? All right, you're most welcome. Sorry I didn't have my actual ink class here. I'll get that up in the Dropbox link. as soon as I get home, or Monday more likely. Hit me up on Facebook, I'll be happy to send the link out. Any questions?
It does say 10, but I bet you could say 10 to 15.
I'm the instructor at 10:15.
Yeah, because
So, but I'm going to end it now, because he has this video that's got to get moved somewhere.
Thank you so much for class.
You're very welcome, happy to be here. Thank you for your interests.